What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Game Time Podcast. We have settled down from our NFL segment. I've gotten away from the Cowboys rant because it's time to talk some Indianapolis high school football. I love Indianapolis high school football. I broadcasted it at Warren Central for 91.1 WEDM for 3 years. Got to see some great football teams, some good basketball teams. But we got someone that knows it all when it comes to high school football. We've got Kyle Neddenriep of the IndyStar here today. Kyle, it's awesome to have you back on again. It's awesome to talk to you again. Great to have you on the Game Time Podcast.
Yeah, good to see you again, Isaiah. Glad you're doing this, and I know you're covering a lot of ground with this podcast, but glad you got some time to talk high school football. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, it is awesome. I've been busy so much with IU East and covering the NAIA, so it's good to I try to keep up with high school football as much as I can. So it's awesome to have you on. The first thing I want to ask you is, if for our audience that may not know you, but I know a lot of people in Indianapolis know you. So for that outer audience, can you kind of talk about your background and what got you started and why you maybe stuck with high school sports?
Yeah, sure. I've been doing this probably almost 20 years in this specific role, covering high school sports for the Indy Star. Went to school I covered some different sports in college, a lot of women's sports actually, which was great. Covered, obviously the main sports as well, basketball, football, but also I learned about field hockey. I learned about all kinds of different sports in college. But really, from a pretty early on, I was always interested in high school sports. I always liked, even when I was younger, following recruiting stuff always interested me. I always wanted, like, who's the next big star or whatever. So I kind of got into it that way. I have covered college, even at the Indy Star. I've covered some college sports. I helped cover the NBA Finals, the NBA playoffs. When the Pacers make it, I usually help out from a kind of a secondary role. I really enjoy that as well. It's a lot of fun. I've helped with the Colts here and there, obviously Indy 500, things like that. But I always come back to high school sports. I just love the interaction you get from a personal standpoint. It's cool to me to get to know the kids before they kind of become the stars, and you get a lot of one-on-one time with them, really, and that's cool to me. You get to tell their story, I take responsibility, try to be responsible with this, is you get to tell their story kind of for the first time. So there are some times where it's like, sometimes when I'm interviewing a kid, especially a boy, they may say something that it's like they may not know what they said, and sometimes I don't include some, just because I know maybe something will get them in trouble or whatever, but not in big trouble, but just like you may not want to say it. But so I try to be responsible. They are high school kids; they're not used to being interviewed a lot of times, but the people I've got to know, I really enjoy it. That's why I've stayed with it, because it's what I like to do. And I think when you find something you like to do, you should do that. I've, like I said, I've had chances to do other things too. It's not like I'm always doing high school sports, but probably 95% of what I do, or maybe more, is high school stuff. And you never run out of stories. I mean, you could go, I could work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and never run out of stories to tell. So that's another cool thing I think about it, is there's, it can be as much as you want it to be, and that's a hard thing sometimes, but it's also a good thing. You always have stuff to do. I have more than I can give stories to other people on staff or ideas or whatever, and that's something I can do as well. But I really do. I just enjoy high school sports, and that's why I've done it for, I've done this, I think, 25 years total, since I graduated college, and probably and almost 20 years at the Indy Star. So it's something I just love to do.
Awesome. So when we look at high school football this upcoming season, correct me if I'm wrong, last year Brownsburg won the 6A for football, correct?
Yes, Brownsburg's coming off the 6A championship. They won. They had won in '85, but it was not, obviously not 6A at that time. So that was their last title since then.
Yeah, and I think for me, when I graduated high school in 2022, so it's been a couple years now, but I always remember Brownsburg being always competitive, always a contender, but they couldn't get over the hump. They couldn't get past regionals, or they couldn't get to semi-state. They always just were a little over the hump. But I think one thing that I think has made it maybe easier for a team like Brownsburg and some other teams that aren't, in the MIC or Carmel or Center Grove is, I don't remember what year it was, but when they realigned the sectional, right? So like now, I remember Warren Central, they used to play, I forgot, I think it was like North Central and Lawrence Central and stuff like that, but now they play and they're in the same with Southport, Perry, and I forgot the other team. How much
Tech.
has that Tech? Gotcha. So how much has that sectional realignment has that helped? And do you think that may have helped Brownsburg get to the 6A title this year, or make it maybe easier for their pathway?
Well, they ended up, so there was a little span there where Carmel was actually coming south, and Brownsburg and Carmel were in the same sectional. Then that changed back after COVID, and now it is a very competitive sectional. It's Ben Davis, Pike's a lot better, and the fourth is Avon. Avon's they're on the come up too. So the sectional isn't that easy, but I would say there's a lot of things that I think contribute to Brownsburg, and also like the HCC is now I think more of on an even playing field than the MIC than it used to be, and I think a lot of that has to do with facilities have changed a lot. The diversity of the schools in the suburban Indianapolis area has changed a lot, and also I think it's just the nature of like we need to get to that level of beating Ben Davis. In Brownsburg's case, it's like that's the standard is Ben Davis, and in a lot of ways still is. I mean, it's only been 2 years ago they won the state title. So if you're coming from the west side, you're coming from the the south half of the 6A bracket, you pretty much know Ben Davis is that team Brownsburg has to beat. Now they're I think on a more level playing field. Obviously they were down 35-7 to Ben Davis in the sectional and came back and won. So it takes a little bit of fortunate everyone needs that, especially in 6A. If
Mm-hmm.
you look at the history of 6A, almost every year the team that wins it has that type of game where they have to. And Brownsburg had several of those last year where they had to come back. Every game they won in the tournament was by one score, within a touchdown. So it takes a little bit of a fortunate, and just coming up clutch. But yeah, I think the standard of we got to beat Ben Davis to get through this thing is that's definitely a part of why I think they are where they are. And if you go out to their stadium now, it's just wildly different than it was even like 5, 6, 7 years ago. It's almost like a college type. It's on par with about anywhere around now. And you look around, like Westfield's like that. Some of the schools that were way off the radar like a decade ago are now on that level. So I think it's kind of it's a bit of an arms race as far as facilities go, and some of those HCC schools have even raised the standard from where it was before. Even for like a Carmel, they're doing massive renovations.
Yeah.
And, they've fallen behind a little bit here in recent years, and now with Kevin Wright coming, we can talk about that later. But I think they're going to be definitely a factor as well.
Awesome. And I'm going to give the floor to Dare here, but before we go to that, when you look at 6A this season, and even 5A, can you kind of lay out maybe your top five or just your contenders, in this preseason as we get ready to ramp up? Who are your contenders heading into the season for football?
Well, I think that's a question I get a lot: is who's the team to beat in 6A, and that's the fun question because that's it's the class that always has so much parity, and it's hard to win back to back, let alone win one. Coming back and winning a second one is really hard to do. So I think you start with Brownsburg because they have 10 starters back on the offensive side. So I think it's fair to kind of give them the preseason nod. I haven't got around to doing the rankings just quite yet, but starting on that this week. But I think they're going to be, they probably rightly should be number one going into the season,
Mm-hmm.
even beyond the defending champ thing. They do have a lot of talent back. But I look at, if you go down the list, I mean, Center Grove is really loaded again. I think they're going to be better against the run. I think they're better. Their quarterback's young. He's a sophomore, a kid named Oscar Sloan, but he's very talented. Their offensive line is big and veteran. So I always look there as a big key as offensive line. Defensive line is also a key, I think, to any successful team. But they're going to be able to run the ball, I think, better. They've kind of struggled running the ball, actually, the last couple of years in comparison to the premier Center Grove teams that always run it well. They have struggled in that area a little bit the last couple of years. I think they're going to do that a lot better. So I would probably put them, tentatively number two. And then, then you look at like Westfield, they lost a lot, but they're always good up front. They're going to run the ball. Their leading rusher, Deacon King, is back. And then, I think it's kind of a toss up after that. I think Warren is very talented, but they only have 4 starters back. So and a new coach. So a little bit of a changeover for Warren, although the talent I like, they have some really good players, JJ Finch and Caleb Elkins and guys like that who are, very, very talented. So I think they'll be a factor. And their route, like you mentioned, their route to the regional is pretty easy. Like they should be there playing Center Grove. Now, how do you stack up with Center Grove? That's always the question for those teams. And then I would throw, just from a curiosity standpoint, Decatur Central is the defending 5A champ, but they're moving up to 6A this year by the success factor. And they have a lot of talent back, but they're not going to have the depth of the schools like, Warren, Center Grove, Brownsburg, just based on the total number of kids they have in their school. So, that'll be a factor. But their top level talent, I think, is very competitive at the 6A level too. They're fast. They have veteran quarterback. Maybe not quite as big overall across the board, but that'll be fun. They slide into that Cathedral. Cathedral moves back down. Decatur jumps in there. And then Lawrence North, I should mention them as well. They were 11-0 last year, and I was on the Lawrence North sideline when they played Brownsburg in the regional, and man, they lost 22-21. They had that, almost had that game put away. They were up by a touchdown, missed a field goal that would have put it away, up by 10 with less than 2 minutes left, missed it. Brownsburg comes back and wins it. And that was a devastating loss for that program that has really been, through the ringer. They have not been good for years. And then Pat Mallory built them up, and they're really a factor now. And they have a lot of talent, too. They did lose an exceptional senior class, I will say. So it'll be interesting how they replace those guys. But the top-level guys on that team are as good as, Sales at receiver and Moore at running back. Those guys are legit. So I wouldn't count them out either. But, 6A is fun because there's always – and then someone will rise up that, maybe a Pike or, somebody that may be better than we think. Not saying they're going to win state, but, maybe could upset somebody or in Avon. Avon will be better, So that's always fun, too, to see some of those teams that maybe don't get all the shine of the year in, year out, top teams, but are definitely capable of winning a game in the sectional or two.
Awesome. Daryl, I'll go ahead and give you the floor for your questions here, and then I'll come back and I got a couple as well.
Kyle, you hit a couple of good things early on in the conversation. You talked about talking to high school kids and how much fun that is and some of the innocence with regard to those communications. So the last 20 years, you've talked to a lot of Division I, Division II players who've gone on to be played in the NFL. What's been one of the biggest surprises you've had from a player perspective that you talked to and you didn't see him becoming the athlete or the future player that he currently is or currently was? And also, who's been, maybe you don't have to name a name, but maybe at school, what's been a little bit of a disappointment with thinking something's going to be bigger than you thought it's going to be bigger than it eventually became?
It's funny you asked that question because I was actually doing a project on like the top recruits of the last 25 years. And we're coming up on this quarter century of football now for the first, it's 2025. So of the century, and kind of going through the guys that have been the most, I would say like highly recruited or touted or whatever. And then the guys who actually performed to the highest level. And the list is totally different from, from one to the other, as you could imagine to a certain degree. But I would start with a guy that I covered, who's right now one of the best receivers in the NFL, is Terry McLaurin, who I knew he was special, with what he did at Cathedral, but I didn't know like he was this, what he would do at this level has just been absolutely amazing. Even at Ohio State, he had a good career. I think he was over 1,000 yards for his career, but didn't have he wasn't like an All-American every year. But he's a hard worker. He's a super likable guy. And, to go do it, he's one of the all-time, players in that program in Washington's history as an NFL franchise, which is amazing to think. So I knew he was special in high school, but I didn't know, maybe at this level, what he would be able to accomplish. Jeremy Chin's another one who's actually with that same Washington Commanders team. He is, at Fishers, he was hurt some in high school. He's a kid who I remember he's related to Steve Atwater, who played in the NFL with Denver Broncos. But then Jeremy went to Southern Illinois. Wasn't like he was a really good player at SIU, but that's not a team you would think is like a college powerhouse. But he's gone on and had a really good career with Washington and Carolina Panthers for a few years when he first got drafted. So he's another one I would think that would come to mind if you kind of start diving into it. Jack Doyle, another Cathedral guy who went on to play for the Colts, was not a big time recruit, went to Western Kentucky, had a good career there. But again, you wouldn't have pegged him maybe as a Pro Bowl tight end, which he became a couple times with the Colts. So, those are the type of guys that, come to mind for me. Randy Gregory, who went on to super talented kid at HSC, played 2 sports. But again, and he's went on, had a little bit of a up and down NFL career, but man, when he's going at his best, he is as good as any defensive end out there. Had a really good college career too at Nebraska for 2 years after going to JUCO. So those are a few off the, that I've covered over the years. And then, there's been like Sheldon Day. I think he's been a guy who's been able to stay in the NFL quite a long time, and was a star at Notre Dame, obviously. Not that he was a surprise. He was very highly touted, even coming out of high school at Warren, and he's gone and done a lot of good things. He comes back and does a camp every year at Warren, and stayed involved in the community there, which has been really cool to see. Some of the guys I always find it, from the other side of your question, the quarterbacks are tough, man. I mean, it's just hard for quarterbacks. And a few years ago, I was kind of like, I give up on trying to project these quarterbacks because it is just really hard. So some of the guys that have come through in recent years from Indiana just have not probably lived up to the billing we thought that they might. You go through and Brandon Peters at Avon, I would have thought he would have been an All-American. He had a good career at Michigan and Illinois, but probably not to the extent of maybe what he looked like in high school that we thought he might be. Like Gunnar Kiel from Columbus East was another super highly touted quarterback that didn't really go on to have a super career and make the NFL and those sorts of things. So, there's been a few of those over the years, and quarterback seems to be just really tough to be able to do that position. So there's been a few of those types over the years as well. Hunter Johnson from Brownsburg, I think he was a 5-star.
That's what I was thinking about. Went to Clemson, right?
Yes, and then
that's my note.
Yeah, ended up at Northwestern, and he was good, but not not what I think people thought he might be. So, the quarterbacks are a position that often comes up in these type of conversations. But it's funny you mentioned that because I was actually just kind of working on a little mini project about that very subject.
Well, that's interesting because I was on my notes. I was thinking about that, right? Projecting out players, because obviously you've got the history of that. And with that said, my thought was been about the quarterbacks in the central Indiana area. Maybe Clemson, Bama, LSU aren't the places for you. Maybe look closer to home, down there in Bloomington, right? Maybe up there in Muncie. Some of those locations that maybe can get you to where maybe you get that playing time and get that ability and get stronger while playing. And then maybe if there's an opportunity for you elsewhere. That's what I think about from the quarterback perspective. What are your thoughts on that, especially since you just mentioned that about those quarterbacks?
I think that's a good call. And I think, honestly, we'll see more of that happening because of the portal situation. And it is sort of like, it's almost like a minor league situation now, trying to play your way up to the majors, basically, where maybe you started at Ball State and depending on how you do, and honestly, I know some coaches are, and this is more for basketball that coaches I've talked to, but that's sort of their pitch to these guys. Hey, come here for a year, and you can play your way up, and that's, it sounds bad. I'm sure fans of those schools wouldn't like to hear that necessarily, but if you can catch lightning in a bottle, maybe put a whole bunch of those guys together, maybe you're going to a Sweet 16 in basketball, or in football, you're making a bowl game. And then a lot of those guys will be off to, and I actually had this conversation with, there's a couple of guys, Jaimin Henson and Jordan Walker, who were playing in the TBT, who are local guys who played I think they were 2016 in high school graduating class. Jordan played at Cathedral. Jaimin played at LN, and Warren actually started out at Warren. But those guys played at Morehead State in college. And Jordan especially, and probably Jaimin too, would have had a chance, in this current setup to play themselves up and they could have gone. Under the previous rules, it was a lot harder to transfer. It just didn't happen as much. But asking them, it was like, would you transfer now if it was the current? They're like, yeah, definitely. I couldn't even get the question out. They're like, yeah,
wow.
we would have transferred, and the opportunities would have been there for them to make some money off that too. So that's the other thing is you're making money off of off NIL, and I know we're going to talk about that in a little bit, but it's just I think that's part of it as well. The transfer rules are less stringent, and also the NIL opportunities and the money you can make is just so much greater at these bigger programs. But I think that's a great point. I mean, I think we will see that more in the coming years, starting out at a smaller program, and then the ability to kind of work your way up is there maybe more than it used to be.
Great response. A couple of things I want to hit on before we do get on NIL. 2018, Warren Central football and basketball. You're talking about Dean Tate and David Bell, two guys that are two of my favorites of recent, right? I've probably got about 50 guys that are my favorites, but those two of recent, right? The reason why Dean Tate was one of my favorites, went to that state finals game, also went to the Ben Davis game where the big man for the right tackle for Cleveland was playing there. I saw Dean Tate play as hard and as well as for a point guard, a lead guard on both ends of the floor that I've ever seen. That Carmel game, if you, I'm sure you were there. That point guard for Carmel had the worst night of his life in that fourth quarter. You're talking about being worn down and playing hard. I want to just kind of bring up Dean Tate and David Bell on that team, what they brought, to that team, and what was your thinking when you're watching this team unfold as an undefeated champion, and then flipping that script and then doing very something special in football as well.
Oh yeah, that was a special group that and in basketball that year, I was kind of like, how are these guys? Because they would win these games ugly. They weren't like they were, and they might argue this, but I would argue against it. And they're a fun group to kind of go back and forth with anyway, because they'll tell you how good they are and then back it up. But they were a group that they might beat you 32 to 31. It wasn't like it was they were scoring a whole bunch of points, but they were as tough as any team I've covered, just from a mental toughness and physical toughness. Even in that Carmel game you mentioned, they went a long time in that game
early
without
on
scoring a point.
Early on, I was cussing in the stands because like, what are you doing here? So as a Warren Central person, you always think from years ago, the refs are in the pocket of the Carmel, right? That's what you were thinking. But they but they stayed true to form, and to your point, mental toughness, and they just kept fighting.
Yeah, and that was the hallmark of that team was like, you just couldn't beat them. And by the end of the year, it kind of bore itself out where they were undefeated, obviously, for the season, which, was just unheard of, and I know Ben Davis did it recently as well, but those were two very special teams. That Warren team, though, one of my favorite memories of all time was that game down at Seymour against New Albany.
Yep.
And they're down by, and that place was off the hook. I mean, that was one of the best environments for a game I've ever seen. And all week long, we knew, it was going to be that way, because even the game that preceded it was Bar Reed Morristown. That place was all the way packed. You just couldn't get a ticket anywhere. And people were showing up. New Albany fans were showing up at all the other three sites during the week trying to get tickets and, forge their, because the teams were obviously trying to keep their
allocated.
Tickets. Allocated. So you had people just showing up everywhere, but it was great. I mean, but being down there, Warren's down by 10, comes back. Of course, David Bell, hits the shot that everybody remembers, but they really just took Romeo out of things late in the game. And I thought that was kind of even as big as David's shot was, what they did defensively to Romeo, which hadn't really been done. No, that kid, I mean, people can say what they want that he was overhyped. He was a sensational high school basketball player. He was unreal. And for Warren to do what they did that night was really outstanding. But that whole team was just Jesse Bingham and Jacoby Robinson. Those guys were just so good, and such a good group of guys. I mean, and I remember David Bell. He would always give me crap about my football predictions, and even if I picked Warren, he was how you saying it's going to be that close of a game or whatever. And I
It's
remember
Warren Central. What are you doing, right?
Right. And before they played in the, I think it was the regional between games, and I tweeted something out about how Terre Haute South was going to keep it close, and then it's late in the game, and I hear someone yelling my name, and I looking around trying to figure out. It said Southport, and I was trying to figure out where it's coming from. I look down, and David's looking at me, pointing up at the scoreboard, and I was like, and they're up by like 30 points or whatever, 35.
What can you say, right?
Yeah,
tip your cap. You tip your cap, right?
I just laughed. I said, "That's only David would think like to tell me about that." Because, but yeah, it was a fun group, such a good group of guys, and obviously Chris Byers and that did a great job. And that coaching staff, DeAndre Brock and that whole group, keeping those guys together all year. But yeah, they won so many games that were like, right down to the wire. They just wouldn't be beaten, and there's something to be said about that. And that team will go down in history. And then obviously with what David did in football as well, in that football team that following year as well. So just a really special time for Warren, and the pride of the East Side was definitely on display throughout that season.
That'll never go away. That is a moniker that will never go away. And the East Side of Indy's had some challenges. We all can acknowledge that. But that school and that organization has uplifted the things that those young men do on our East Side, still live East Side, further out east now. But what they do for the community, the cleanups that they do, the all the things that leadership and the organization have done for the East Side, it has to be commended. So, 2 thumbs up to Warren Central and just Warren Township as a whole, but continue to fight through the challenges of the East Side for sure.
I always say that.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. I would always say that nobody, when things are going well, and they certainly were that year, nobody gets behind them like Warren Central does, and that was really special time, and it was fun to see, and the girls team too. I mean, it was just a really outstanding calendar year for Warren Central, and but yeah, it's that team again. Well, Dean Tate too. I mean, you mentioned him, but such a great leader,
fighter.
Antoine Cushenberry, who just guys you couldn't beat. They were just so tough.
And I don't want to hog up and just only talk Warren, but I'm biased. So one of the things about Dean Tate, he didn't get a lot of offers, right? A hell of a player. I think he was all conference in both, and I think he was all state, if I remember right, in football, but not basketball. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. Well, a guy like that, undersized, is that just the biggest reason why a young man like that doesn't get the opportunities that maybe guys that are 3 inches taller and 20 pounds heavier would get?
That's a lot of it. And Dean ended up making the Indian All-Star team, which I thought was great because I thought he earned that right. But yeah, I think that's the biggest part of it is just like, people can walk in the gym and see what he looks like, and I think that crosses him off a lot of lists just because of how tall he was. Unfortunately, that's, the same thing with Cushenberry was a lot the same way. Those guys could play though. I mean, and you don't, until you really watch them, multiple games, and, even David wasn't like, he wasn't a speed burner, but if you watch him I remember the first practice, I was there with Jason West watching, he's like, watch this, David, watch it. I forget what number he was wearing. It wasn't number 4, like he ended up wearing, but he's like, watch this kid, number whatever. And he just catches everything. And he didn't have a lot of separation at that age, and he wasn't very big, but he caught everything, and he wouldn't drop a ball. And I think that's the same for those guys. They just know how to play, know how to win, and they're going to find ways to beat you. And that's something you can't, unless you're scouting them multiple times. You're not going to maybe see that in one game or one, all-star setting or whatever. They may not stand out in an all-star game, but if you watch them with the team they're with and how they react, how other guys react to them too, you can kind of get a sense of who they are. They had a lot of guys like that on that team that went on and they were winners, and I think that's to be commended for that whole group.
Definitely. And then my last one before we start talking NIL, young man, Jeremy Finch. You talk, of course, he's committed there, as you see behind me, which I will be seeing him the next year when he gets there. Hopefully, he can play well. But talk a little bit about Jeremy Finch, his pathway. Obviously, his dad's an Orange Central graduate, went to the University of Florida, got derailed. I think he had a broken arm or collarbone that really put him in a bad spot. Speak a little bit about Jeremy Finch, and then I'll give it back to Isaiah, and then we can talk NIL and some other things as well.
Yeah, Jeremy's been on the radar for quite a long time. And sometimes, and he's got the name, obviously, like you mentioned, people around here know, like, I can't say how many times I've heard, like, how does Jeremy Finch have a kid play? That makes me feel old that he's got a kid playing at Warren now and those sorts of things. But JJ's been big about, like, he wants to make his own name, as much as that may, not to say anything against what his dad did, but he wants to make his own name. And I think that drives him to, kind of be the player he's become. And if you look at that team last year, how many guys they had on that defensive line who were
Shanklin, Shanklin, are you kidding me?
And Burris and Marcus Bell Jr. I mean, they had all kinds of talent up front, but at the end of the day, Finch led them in tackles. He led them in, I think he led in sacks, although Shanklin may have been pretty close, but at any rate, his numbers were as good as anybody on that line. Now, I'm curious this year to see, like, how are they going to – I talked to JT Whitaker about that. He said they're going to try to use him, as an end rusher, obviously, but also a linebacker and playing up front on the D-tackle spot. They're going to move him around to kind of utilize his talent the best they can. I don't know, specifically, how much he'll be, where he'll be, like, percentage wise, position wise, but I think they'll try to move him around, make him effective from some different areas of the field and let him just use his talent as much as possible. But yeah, I think he's, if you, if you look at the returners on the defensive line around the state, I think he'll be definitely a top contender for that Mr. Football defensive line spot. And then if he can have a great year, and if Warren can have a great year, maybe he's got the name already to maybe put himself in that position to be one of the front runners for the big award. It's so hard for a defensive guy to win that award. It's normally quarterback, running back, receiver, which it's kind of like the Heisman. Those guys normally are going to win it. So maybe he doesn't have a chance to win that, but I think he can at least put himself in that consideration. And I talked to him here not too long ago, and I know he's got a lot of big plans and hopes for this season. And he'll be a leader for that team. Just like I said earlier, they don't have a lot of returning talent as far as like returning starters anyway. They have a lot of talent, not starters. So he's going to be definitely in the mix to try to lead that team. And, new coaching staff, a lot of new things there, but he's one of the guys who's, familiar around there and kind of knows. He's not a super, like, I would say outgoing, talkative, he's not, he's just kind of a more quieter guy, but I think he can lead that team by example in a lot of ways and use his voice too to be a leader this year. And I'm looking forward to seeing what he does. I think he's going to have another big year. I don't know how, he's kind of unblockable. So I think he's going to have a big year.
Definitely plan to get there and see a few games this year myself. Definitely appreciate that for sure. Isaiah, I know you want to touch on some things there. I'm gonna pass it to you and just so call us in, man.
Yeah, so I think there's two questions I want to ask, and then one of them's kind of close to NIL, the other one isn't. And the first one is when teams go up from 5A to 6A, I've always found that so interesting, or go down. How does that whole process work? Because I know it's based off winning, and then I know it's also based off like the capacity of a school. So I remember New Pal a couple of years ago, they got three or two state championships in a row. And then I don't remember if they moved up or whatever, but how does that process work as a whole for teams? Like you just said, Decatur Central went up, but then Cathedral went down. So what is the rules and kind of the guidelines for all of that? Because I've always been curious.
Yeah, so they added that tournament success factor is what they call it. The IHSAA added that. I think it was 2013. I think it was the same year they added the sixth class for football. And basically there was sort of kind of the reason it came about was there were so many teams winning in the same class every year. A lot of it was the smaller class, the private parochial schools that really dominated the lower classes. Chittard, obviously, and they continue to win anyway. Not like, or Bishop Lures, people like that were winning just in the same class a lot. So they did this, and I kind of like the rule. It basically is a 2-year window where if you win, if you get 6 points, you get 4 points for a state title, 3 for a semi-state, 2 for a regional, 1 for a sectional. So if you get 2 points in a 2-year window, or if you get 6 points in a 2-year window, you bump up a class for the next cycle. So
Mm.
so if you win a state and a regional, say that's 6, then you bump up for the next 2 years. And if you're in that higher class and now they've sort of changed the threshold on this. Now it's back to 2 points. So if you're in that upper class and you get 2 points, which is basically back-to-back sectional titles, you stay in that class for another 2-year window. So that's kind of what has happened to Cathedral. Cathedral is technically a 4A program, but they have not played in 4A for forever, because if they've been 6A and 5A, now they're 5A, but because they didn't get enough points to stay 6A. But I can't imagine they won't stay 5A. All they got to do is win a couple sectional titles and they'll stay up. So now they've changed a little bit too, where it used to be the 2-year window of the classification cycle, and they're trying not to get too in the weeds here, but they've changed it to where, your cycle can be whatever the previous 2 years are. So now, like Decatur this year, it's not even a classification cycle, but they bumped up because they went to state 2 years ago and then won state last year. So they automatically bumped up for these next 2 years to 6A. Same with New Pal is now 5A. They went from 4A to 5A. And Heritage Hills went from 3A to 4A, the program down south that won 3A last year. So you've had quite a bit of movement going into this year. So New Pal being 5A, they're in with Cathedral now. So they're going to play most likely in the sectional against each other. So that'll be interesting. But yeah, it changes doing this annually now, and you can't move, like Cathedral can't move back to 6A next year, no matter what they do this year. It's going to be another 2 years before they are eligible to move again. So it sticks you in that class for the next 2-year cycle, but it changes annually. Like if somebody wins, say Lutheran wins state, and they were a regional title last year, they could go up this year. So
they would have the option, or is it just they have to
it's
wait?
automatic. Yeah, it's
Gotcha.
automatic.
Okay.
Yeah, you can always as a school, and this rarely happens, but
Mhm.
if Cathedral wanted to stay 6A, they could tell the IHSAA, like, hey, we just want to stay in 6A. But the numbers bump you down, and most schools aren't going to say, yeah, we're going to play above our classification level. They're going to play wherever
Yeah.
the IHSAA puts them. So, but that's something there has been a couple teams that have done that over the years, but it's pretty rare.
And then for the teams in 6A, like the top teams, right? They can't ever move down because of the capacity, correct? Whether they're being successful or not.
Yeah, so they're protected by, and it used to be too, where say the 32nd biggest team, they would bump, if Cathedral bumped up by the success factor, that team might bump down to 5A just because of the space of the class. They had 32 teams. Now they just keep them, even if it's 33 teams, they just keep them up there. So you are in that class based on enrollment, regardless of somebody else coming up. So yeah, that's sort of how that works. And over the years, I think it's been mostly good. I would say, it's affected definitely more of the private schools in the smaller classes than anybody. But I think it's sort of, those schools that win every year probably should be playing up anyway, just based on how good you are. There's a lot of things that go into it, different states do different things. They may do like a multiplier for the private schools. I know some states do that. But at least in this case, it's program by program. It's not, so Cathedral's soccer program is not affected by what the football team does. So it's kind of based on, it's not a school thing. It's a program thing. So I think that from that standpoint, I think it's been a good change.
Gotcha. I've always been curious how that works, because I remember New Pal, it was like that 2014 to 2015 run, and I think it was in 5A when they were doing it, or it was a mix of 4A and 5A, and I was like, I wonder if they could ever move up to 6A, but it was like, no, capacity, stuff like that. So I remember I've always been curious how that works. So it's good to see that, it's benefiting some schools, and then, it's working out as a whole. And then this kind of leads into our NIL part, is the ability to transfer now. I know that is a new thing when it comes to high school. I know, I remember being at Warren and somebody would come to our school to play, but it's like, oh, the other school would hold their transcripts or do something like that to kind of but now that process has become easier. You're allowed, I think, one transfer it is. But so for people who don't know how that's all kind of working out, can you explain that transfer for us when it comes to high school? And even can you give your overall thoughts on how you feel about them adding this in?
Yeah, so it's been kind of a muddy situation from the standpoint of like the current, because it went into effect on June 1st, basically. So the IHSAA made this change kind of based on what the state legislature, and this is happening in a lot of states where state legislature wanted to basically, they want kids to have school choice or parents to have school choice, and athletics not to be affected by that decision. Where here in Indiana, if you transfer for athletic reasons, you were, basically deemed, not ineligible, but you couldn't play varsity for a year.
Yeah.
If it was found out that you were transferred, now, I will say, like, it didn't always, some kids were kind of let through, some weren't. That led to sometimes court cases. Sometimes, if you remember Jaden Brewer a few years ago, who played at Ben Davis,
Yeah.
he was playing JV his senior year for like half the year because he wasn't eligible. Went to court, got it overturned, then was able to play the rest of his senior season. So sometimes those things have come to the courts, and so anyway, so you go back to, the legislature getting involved. The IHSAA said, "Hey, let us, push this through. That way, we can sort of dictate what happens with the transfers. We can still legislate it and not have the state, kind of become the enforcer of this." So, I think from that standpoint, it's probably a good thing. I think you still want somebody like the IHSAA involved to oversee this. I know people have, people may not always like the results. I don't always agree with what they, decisions or whatever. And I'm sure that's, not uncommon for every, people who follow this to think that.
Mm-hmm.
But at least this way, you have someone who's been involved in high school sports making those decisions. So that's what's happening now. And with this first time transfer, basically what they're saying is if you're a freshman, sophomore, have not completed your junior year, you have the freedom for your first transfer to basically be free. You don't have to do anything. You can transfer wherever you want to. You get one sort of freebie, unless there's found to be some sort of like, hey, there's a, you're finding out that they recruited you there. There's some sort of paper trail saying they just brought you over here for basketball or whatnot. There can't just be outright recruiting and undue influence involved. But if you want to get up and say, I'm going to transfer from Cecina to Warren, and you're a sophomore after your sophomore year and you haven't transferred before, you're free to do that. Basically, no questions asked. So it's not like the other school, not like Cecina would have to sign off or, that sort of thing. They're just free to do that. Now, where it's gotten a little sticky, muddy is this senior class. And I think seniors will be, I think once we get through this year, it's going to be more black and white, which I think can be a good thing. But for this senior class, it's been sort of tricky because a lot of these kids who haven't transferred are sort of getting caught up in the, we went from the old rule to the new rule. Some kids transferred before the June 1st date, like Kai McGrew, who went from LN to Fishers. They did not sign off on his transfer, so he's going to have to appeal it or probably go to prep school. So we'll see what happens there. But and a lot of so eventually what will happen is if you're a senior, if you have a bona fide move of like, I think it's 50 miles, what they're saying, then you have your choice of any school within like a 20-mile radius. If your family moves, you can gain eligibility that way. Otherwise, if you don't move, you're going to have to sit out 30 competition days, which is basically from, say football starts August 22nd, it would be, from that week of the first games, 30 days you have to sit out. So basically you'd probably be sitting out 4 games and then you get eligible. So that will be something in the future. I think we'll see more. Even this year, the kids who transferred after June 1st, you'll see some of those kids who transfer to seniors have to sit out the first 4 games for football, and probably a few more for basketball based on the calendar. So, I think in the long run, my thoughts, I guess, would be, I think anything that sort of takes, that makes it more black and white and makes it a little bit more like, I know if I'm going to transfer, I kind of know what the ultimate decisions are going to be. Where in the past, I think it's been like, well, I see this kid move, he transferred schools, but he didn't move, and the school signed off on him, and he got full eligibility. There was no where if I transfer and the school doesn't sign off, then I'm stuck like based on a IHSAA decision of eligibility. I may not even be able to play for a year. So I think it was sort of like, what's fair? Like, why is that kid eligible? I'm in the same situation. I'm not eligible. I don't know. There's a lot different. Every situation's different, but it was hard for me to look at that and say, what's really right here? Who's making the decisions that are right for the kid? If there's obvious recruiting, I think that's wrong too. That schools shouldn't be doing that, or coaches shouldn't be doing that. But at the same time, it's all sort of intertwined anymore. So many staffs have AAU coaches and travel coaches on their staffs. It's just, and I'm not saying that's wrong. It's just the way it is. That's just, there are relationships with kids that you can't legislate that. It's just, that's the nature of it anymore. But I do, in the long run, I think it's going to be good, because I think it's going to be more black and white. I think parents will know, all right, if I'm a senior and I didn't move, I'm probably going to have to sit out part of the year. And if you're willing to do that, at least that going into it. And as a freshman and sophomore, like, there may be kids who say, I can't play here. I need to go somewhere else where I can maybe have a better chance to be on the team and compete and actually play. You may be at Warren and say, I'm just never going to play here. I'm going to try something else. And you get that opportunity to do that. I think that's not a bad thing in the long run. So, and as these schools get bigger and bigger, there'll probably be a lot of those kids who like, hey, I just want to go to a smaller school and try to play. And I'm not sure there's anything wrong with that. So I don't know. There's a lot of different pluses and minuses, I would say, but I think the transparency of being more black and white, it can be a good thing for sure.
No, I would agree with you, because I remember being at Warren, and when Tay Davis transferred in, it was like there was nothing. But I think maybe that's because his dad became the head coach and something like that. But then we had a player on the women's team. She transferred, but she had to play JV. It was the same year, I remember, and I was just like, that's a little weird. Where it's like, because maybe it's because it was dad's the head coach, or he was going to be D1 and something like that. So I kind of see where it's like with the old rule, these high value, the top high school players, if they transferred, it was fine. But if you had these people that, maybe they could be D1 in another sport, but it's like they're just playing this other sport to play it, and they transfer, they got to wait, or they got to do a JV. So I do like the rule. Daryl, I'll give the floor to you. But what are your thoughts on that rule as well?
Well, I like it because to your point, Kyle, it's taking control of the IHSAA versus the state, right? And just like if you take a look at NIL, colleges and NCAA turn their backs. Oh, it'll get figured out. And now look what they've got, right? They've got a mess because they didn't jump in and say, let's get this figured out ourselves. What you're saying is, it's like locally we've trying to get a hold of this so we can put some guardrails in place so we can continue to move forward. I think that makes a lot of sense. If you're talking about these young men and women looking to better themselves, right? And that's a tie-in to the NIL piece. Now you've got kids that are seniors in high school verbally committing to a school. And now what I'm hearing from Kirby Smart is that some of these schools are paying young men and women to verbal commit, like so in Finch's case. Bama pays you, not saying they did or didn't, $70,000 to verbally commit. And then on signing day, first signing day, you get an additional X amount. What are you hearing about that from a school perspective, and what are your thoughts on that being a positive, and how it's helping or hindering our young men and women in high school?
Well, I'm all for NIL at the college level because I think you only have a short time as an athlete to sort of make money off. And some of these kids won't. They're not going to play professionally. So
a lot of them won't.
Yeah, at least not. And there are opportunities overseas, like for basketball players to play, have really good careers overseas, and they go on and play wherever. I ran into a kid yesterday who's playing in a league in Vietnam professionally.
Wow.
That so it's been 12 years since he was in high school, but he's still playing. But yeah, I mean, so there are opportunities to do that, but to make real money, that's real life-changing money, it can be a pretty short window, especially in football, as we know, where your careers are very short a lot of times. So, you have a short time to make as much money as you can. I'm all for that. I think, it's a good thing. Where it gets tricky to me is like some states have passed rules for high school kids to be able to make money off NIL. That's a tricky one to me, because if you're talking about recruiting issues, man, I mean, what's to keep a school from, sort of putting a package together for an 8th grade kid and say, hey, come here, and and I think that would probably be against the rules, but who's going to stop that from happening? And that to me is where, because when NIL first started, I didn't realize it would be such a recruiting tool. I thought it'd be more like, hey, if you want to, get your name up on a billboard and promote Taco Bell or something, that would be, or your jersey
car dealerships or something like that.
I didn't think it'd be flat out recruiting, which I guess is stupid. I should have thought that would be part of it, but that's all it's become, sort of, in a lot of ways.
It's an arms race right now at this point, and that's what we've been talking about and trying to get on our platform to share more about it, because I know that it's not talked about as much as I'd like it to be talked about. The ins and outs of the NIL. Young men and women who are sophomores and juniors in high school are more than likely now having to go to a lesser school because of the transfer portal. Also, coaches are saying, I don't want to. We had coaches on here saying, I don't want to bring in 6 or 7 freshmen on my basketball team. I can't win that way. I've got to have about 4 or 5 men who are 19, 20, or 21. Then I'll sprinkle in a couple of freshmen. But the days of the Fab Five, and the Michigan days, or even better yet, the IU class of '87, at Calvert Taney, Greg Graham, other Graham. Those days may be over because of the fact that you just don't have the resources or the ability to stay and grow as a coach, because the time is ticking.
I think Coach Hester said it when we had him on. He was, or it wasn't, I don't remember exactly who it was when we had them on, but it's basically, you look at these NAIA schools, and that's our example, because we've had multiple coaches from that level on, where they say, Hester, for example, said, I have enough returners to where we mainly recruited high school people. But then you've got Coach Scott Moore at Grace, where, he's looking at winners, he's looking at, different players and stuff like that. But it's like these NAIA coaches, the high school kids, unless you're a top talent, are at the bottom of the list, because those NAIA schools and JUCO schools, they're seeing what's going to fall above them from the D1 level or the D2 level. And it kind of puts these high school kids in a bad position, if that makes sense.
Oh, that's definitely. And I was at the Charlie Hughes in June, which is like, the biggest high school event of the summer, as far as like high school teams playing together. Yeah, now the college coaches can come watch that these last probably 5 or 6 years. And anyway, the 26 class, most of these guys just don't have a lot going on with their recruit, even the top guys. It's amazing to me, like Noah Smith at Plainfield, who, to me, like 10 years ago, he would have been a no doubt Big Ten. Someone would have taken him and stuffed him away, probably like at Purdue, got him stronger for a year, and then he would have been like an all Big Ten. In my opinion, I think he can be that type of player. Now he's got DePaul, but then like a lot of mid majors, and it's just, to me, unless I'm misassessing his talent, I don't think I am, but to me, it's just so much about like the portal. There are just not as many current opportunities for a high school kid, and more than likely, coaches are not going to just want to stuff a kid away and have him develop physically. They're going to want to go get a guy who's already developed. And I probably would too. If I was a college coach, it'd be like, well, why not take what you know rather than what you don't know? And what a junior in college can bring you, a 21-year-old kid. Like Daryl said, why not take that kid rather than a 17, 18-year-old that you don't know for sure, like how he's going to develop. So that's been frustrating to see for me, for a lot of these high school kids, because I know a lot of these kids in this 26 class just, it's crazy, and they may not know any different because they haven't gone through it or seen it like I did for many years. But I do see, I think it's a big change, and I feel bad for, I think it'll eventually, like they may have to go somewhere smaller and then work their way up, like we talked about earlier. But man, the opportunities right away, just they aren't there as much as they used to be.
And I think too, to that point, Kyle, I think it betters the player long term. Think about this, right? What did Nebraska do in the 70s and 80s? If you were an incoming freshman, Nebraska football, you were redshirting. It didn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because they wanted to grow you and develop you, right? And it feels that way with regard to current. You're going to go, you had an opportunity, maybe 15 years ago to go to Indiana, but now maybe Indiana's not in the plan. Maybe now your best opportunity is Ball State. Or maybe if you're not a Ball State kid, maybe you're a Grace College kid, right? And all you got 2 years to work on your game, better young man or woman, and then say, now I'm ready and I'm here for you. I think this is something that these young men and women can really take advantage of if they've got the right direction, the right leadership, and the right support from parenting, from the administration of schools, and the collective as a whole. Just wanted to kind of share. What do you think about that? I think I can almost like a semi-pro, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's something that can be had for these young men and women.
Definitely. And I look at a guy like EJ Haslett, who just committed to Indiana State this past Friday. I think it was a couple days ago, Thursday maybe. But he was a very highly touted player at Franklin Central. He's going. Actually, his dad Ed played it. I'm sure played at Warren back in the day, and he's a really good guy. He's Kankakee's high school football coach now. So EJ went over there to play his senior year, but Indiana State, got a commitment from him. He's talented enough, if he puts it all together, to go on and play at a higher level. But from the other standpoint, I was thinking about this situation. He's got to go in there and try to prove himself from the ground up. If you think you're better than Indiana State, I'm not saying he does, but just from a more generic standpoint, you got to go in there and really work, because it is a high, you are making a big jump from high school to college, regardless of what level you're playing at. But you got to go in there and really have the right attitude and really work your butt off, and then maybe those opportunities come. But yeah, I do agree with you. I think it can be a good thing. It's sort of a prove it nature now, and maybe those top 25 kids, they're going to be recruited like they always were, because those guys are different, talent wise. But for the rest of them, it's sort of like you got to go go somewhere and prove it, and then the opportunity may be there for you.
Yeah, I kind of agree with Daryl was saying, but Daryl, we've had these conversations with Hester, Coach Scott Moore, and even the Coach Wood, Coach Wood, who we talked to in California, where it's like, you use the NAIA and you use the Division II as a development system, but then you look at, and I think Hester just kind of talked about it, how it affects those NAIA schools, right? Because, you're trying to, those coaches are trying to keep their job and have a winning program, but then you've got people leaving and you got people staying, depending on
plucking your players, as he talked about, remember,
yeah,
right?
Depending on what the situation is. Like Coach Scott Moore, he said it on the pod, he's had one transfer, and that's only because that person's family moved and he wanted them, he didn't want to leave him out, have him stay out in Indiana while his family moved to whatever state he mentioned on the pod.
I think Florida.
Yeah, he's only had one transfer, but then you've got these other lower NAIA schools that are trying to just win their conference to get to the national tournament, where it's like you've got changes in and out. But then Hester said, we have a bunch of returners coming, so he felt it was okay to bring in freshmen, but it's just a slippery slope, right? Because you've got people that are in the NAIA system that, they go from one school to the next school to the next school just to get to D1. Whereas if they stay with that one NAIA school and they're the leading scorer, the all-time scorer, that senior or junior year, they can get to the D1 level.
Yeah, and I think too, if you're a perspective from a fan too, if you're a fan of like a mid-major team like Indiana State, whatever, Missouri Valley type team, how hard is it for them to sort of keep track year to year of like and that's from a fan's perspective. It's like you sort of get used to like, oh, I really enjoyed watching this kid play. I'm looking forward to, and he's gone, So it's like, I get it from that standpoint too. It's like, man, it's hard to be a fan if you're a mid-major. And I think that has hurt some of the attendance and things like that too. Cause from your standpoint as a fan, it's like, well, I don't know these guys that come in the next year. It's a totally different team, and Indiana State's an example because that happened with Josh Schertz. They won all those games, and then basically the whole team was gone. The next
Yeah,
year.
that was
So
just that was real disappointing because of what they had done the year prior. And you think of it like you said, Kyle, Indiana State. You're not thinking this isn't Michigan, this isn't this is Indiana State, and all of a sudden the team just it goes upside down, and that's disappointing for fans because you pour your energy, your finances, you go to games, you travel, and then all of a sudden that happens, then you say, well, I'm not going to do that again because I remember what happened. So now attendance suffers, right?
mhm.
Support, suffers. I think, to Isaiah's point, this slope is far from being told. I wouldn't be surprised if this story isn't told in 5 years because we don't know what the residual is going to be behind that type of situation happening.
Yeah, and we'll see. I mean, college sports is definitely in a time of flux with all of this stuff. So I think it's almost like the news cycle of politics or something. It's like you almost can't keep up. It's like drinking from a fire hose. It's like
Yeah.
it's just always something different.
The
So
good, you mean the good old days, right?
yeah,
Drinking from a fire, right? Now
right,
they say all these bad things out of that's all you. That was our Gatorade. That
right,
was our Gatorade. Now it's taboo. You can't drink that stuff. What are you
right.
doing, right? So times have changed for sure, right?
Absolutely. And I don't know where, I hope, hopefully it works out. I mean, it is sort of it's a little bit like from a fan's perspective, it is sort of because that Indiana State example, it felt like they were building something, and then it's like
Yeah.
you're going back to ground zero, and
Yeah.
all that momentum has sort of gone away. But yeah, I mean, from a player standpoint, I think there are some good things that come out of this. I just hope that I wouldn't mind seeing the transfer rule become a little bit more stringent, and
Yeah.
maybe putting a little bit of that back in. I don't think would hurt the game. College sports. I think some of that maybe would help a little bit and help the fan. Not that there's not fan interest, but just the knowing who's on your team year to year. I think that could be helpful.
And we
Yeah.
talked about it a couple months ago. I think we've talked about like a buyout system or something like that. I mean, I think there may be a
Mhm.
point where, instead of a
Yeah.
transfer portal, it's literally like a free agency thing where it's like, because we've talked about a buyout where it's like these players will have like a 2-year contract or like you have to stay here a
Yeah,
certain amount of years and you can't get out of
Commitment.
it. Like
So
I feel
like the
like it
military.
I
Like the
feel like
right,
it'll,
military.
yeah, I just feel like we're going to get to a point where, like you said, and like a lot of coaches have said, a lot of people said, where the NCAA let this get out of hand. And I feel like we will get to a point where it's going to be like a free agency type thing where it's like, okay, you've got these recruits and that may be something different. But for the players that want out, instead of it's like a transfer, it's like, people are going to have contracts and it's like, okay,
Yeah.
once that certain season ends, there's like this free agency period. I think it'll all be, it's a
Sort of like the
weird,
recruiting period. It's like the
it,
recruiting period now,
Mhm.
right?
it,
So after the year, you've got this 45-day window. Once the
yeah,
45-day, and just as an example, once after the
yeah.
45-day window closes, well, you got to go back to school, and that's what you've got because now the window's closed.
I just
Because
think,
if you don't put those guardrails in place, they
yeah,
didn't. You see, you've got the wild wild west.
it's literally like a snowball, and it's just building and building and going and going. And then I think it's all even like it's affecting other sports too. You've got volleyball and all these other sports that because football and basketball are taking this big leap, or this program, some programs have had to downsize and everything else, and then you see sports like volleyball, which I think volleyball's made traction. Women's and men's are making big traction with mainstream audiences and stuff like that. You're seeing these programs have to take hits in other sports because of how big basketball and football and even to an extent baseball have gotten with NIL and stuff.
Yeah, and it'll be yeah, I mean, and the conference stuff too. It's like, how much sense does it make for USC to be in a conference with Penn State or,
Yeah.
Rutgers?
That's
It's just
money.
it's just,
Yeah, that's not the big.
it's
Is what the Big 18 now? Is that
yeah,
Big 18 went from, yeah, and to that point, money because you're talking, far West Coast, Midwest. That just can't be right, And we can talk about, hey, get off my lawn, guy, but that's just not right.
no.
It's
They've
just
taken
not
a
right.
sledgehammer to a lot of the great rivalries like,
Mm-hmm.
Cal and they're not in the same conference. Cal and UCLA are not. How much sense does that make? Or
Yeah.
Yeah.
Missouri and Kansas are not in the same conference anymore. So you've taken a sledgehammer to a lot of these great rivalries that kind of made college sports what it was. And
Yeah.
and especially like Isaiah said, for the minor sports like soccer teams playing all across the country on weeknights doesn't make much sense to me either. So hopefully maybe that comes back and they pod these teams together. Even if you're in the same conference, maybe there's sort of divisions they put in within those that you're playing more geography sensibility with that. So that to me would I'd love to see more geographical rivalries come back into it as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think go ahead.
Oh,
I'm
go
sorry.
ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna end it off with one last question. Then I was gonna do the outro.
And I'll have one too when you get
you
done.
go ahead. You go ahead real quick.
Last one for me was written down. Talent in the Midwest. And I'm talking football. We know you've got Florida, you've got Texas, you've got California, you got Pennsylvania, you've got Georgia. Where does Indiana sit now, Kyle? 20 years. Where does Indiana sit now compared to those states? I know we're not there yet, but where do we sit in Kyle's opinion?
I think we are in a better place now than ever. And I look at like the national rankings that, people put out. High School Football America, they do a really good one that I always kind of follow. They do a top 300, and we had 7 teams in that top 100 or top 300, and I think 3 in the top 100, if I remember correctly. So, and those don't always mean everything, but I think what that shows me is like the respect factor is there.
Yeah.
People know, Indiana now, especially 6A, which that's sort of what people are looking at anyway from these national rankings. People know these names now. They know Warren, they know Center Grove. They know some of these names that are year in and year out. Ben Davis that are really good. In the Cathedral, they're in there again. So that some of those names are in there. Year in and year out. The national recruiting rankings, I think, show that as well, where guys like JJ Finch are up real high and getting noticed. And, so I think that's good. I think it's in a better place than it's been. You could go down a lot of lists of reasons why the Colts, certainly factor into that, and being able to play your state championships at Lucas Oil, I think is a big help with that too. Everybody knows where the season ends, and it's always a great atmosphere. So yeah, I think, the talent level is very high. 6A football is fantastic. And the fact that, our top teams have been able to go beat, they don't always beat them, but to go beat like St. Xavier out of Cincinnati or, Louisville Trinity, those are big things that, maybe have risen the level of like, oh, wow, that Center Grove just beat Louisville Trinity. That's a point in our direction. I always pull for no matter which teams are playing there, always pull for our teams to do that. So yeah, I mean, that's been good too. Those games don't always, from a standpoint of like rivalries and things, I don't necessarily enjoy those games, but from a bragging rights standpoint, it's important to beat those teams. So I think that has helped dramatically as well. We've held our share against those other top, Kentucky, Ohio, especially Kentucky and Ohio in football, I would say.
Definitely. Okay, good stuff.
And then my last question for me would be if you could give any advice to athletes at the high school level, maybe especially like juniors and seniors, trying to decide on college and everything else. You've seen the landscape change and it's evolving right now. What is some advice you would give them, when it comes to making those decisions? Because there's a lot riding on it, especially when, whether you're making, you're trying to go to a top D1 school because you're just that talented, or you're trying to figure out, should I go D1 or go lower? What's kind of your advice? Because you've seen a lot of commitments. You've been there for a lot of signing day. So what would be your advice as the landscape continues to change?
Well, it's sort of generic, but finding the best fit, personality wise, playing style wise, being able to see like, I think too, like being able to see like how you plan to use me, asking those sorts of questions, like and getting examples of like, how do you plan to use me, or where do you see me? Asking questions is important to the coaches where you're going to be playing. But yeah, I mean, I think, and like you said, it has changed a lot. Sometimes you don't have that many options. You're just looking for, hey, you give me a chance, I'm going to go do the best I can, and then maybe something else will happen after that. So you're not always in the driver's seat in these conversations either. But I think it's just getting, and use your parents, use your grandparents, use your aunts and uncles, bounce ideas off them. Talk to your coaches, make sure your high school coach is involved with your recruitment. They're going to know you better than you probably know yourself. They've seen you. They've seen all sides of you, most likely, from better or worse or whatever. So use them, get them involved, and most of these coaches are involved and trying to help you out. So utilize them, their expertise, your position coaches, those sorts of things, and make an educated decision on where you think you can be. Because sometimes, man, it's like a lot of these kids may think like I'm D1 all the way. Well, hey, man, especially like basketball, there's all kinds of D2 options. There's NAIA options, football too, honestly. There's great NAIA programs in our state. There's great D3 programs in our, look at Wabash and Franklin, DePaul, those, look how many Indiana kids play at those programs every year. So there are great options out there. They may not have, and academics will play a factor in that too. Like, D3s aren't giving you academic, but they are athletic, but they can get you academic help. So that's important as well, keeping your grades up and that sort of thing. But I would just say, look, from a general standpoint, like try to find out and visit these places and figure out where you're going to fit the best. And a lot of times, and I love when kids stay closer to home when they stay in state, and I can watch them, from a more of a close footprint. But some of these kids they're bound to go farther away, and that may be better for them as well. But yeah, I mean, I think finding the best fit, for yourself and whatever works for your family is going to be of utmost importance.
Awesome. Well, folks, that is going to do it. Kyle, it was awesome having you on. But that is going to do it, folks. Make sure to like and subscribe. And we have plenty of content coming out on the way. We are available on YouTube Music, and Spotify. Don't go anywhere, folks. We've got more content coming up right here on the Game Time Podcast.